The text message came in at 3:51 in the afternoon. I was on the Burnside Bridge, stopped at a light, and my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I didn't pick it up then. I waited until I pulled into the Plaid Pantry on 28th and read it in the parking lot with the engine still running. Dad, we need to talk when you get home. Diane and I have been thinking. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the seat and pulled back onto the road. I've spent 41 years reading structural assessments, soil reports, load calculations, the kind of documents where a single misplaced decimal means a bridge fails in 20 years instead of 50. You learn to read what the numbers don't say. You learn that the most important information is usually in what's been left out. Nathan's message had 11 words. It didn't say, "I love you," "Dad," or "We have some news," or "Can you pick up milk on the way?" It said, "We need to talk," and "We've been thinking." The passive construction, the plural, the fact that Diane's name came first in his mind even as he typed it second. I turned on to Eastmoreland at 4:23. The suitcase was already on the front porch. I stopped the car at the curb and sat. The engine idled. I looked at the house the way I used to look at a site plan before a pour, methodically, left to right, noting everything. The brown Samsonite was standing upright on the welcome mat, the same one Carol had picked out at a luggage shop on Hawthorne in 2009 when we drove to her sister's wedding in Spokane. The handle was extended, like someone had set it down in a hurry or wanted it to look ready. Nathan was visible through the screen door, a shape in the hallway. Diane was behind him, a little to the left. I sat in the car for 90 seconds. I know because the radio was on a Sunday afternoon program on OPB, and I listened to approximately 90 seconds of it without hearing a single word. The sunroom on the east side of the house caught the late afternoon light the way I'd calculated it would when I drew the addition in 1998. Nathan was 12 that summer. He used to bring his homework out there on weekday afternoons and spread it across the floor while I worked on the drafting table I'd set up by the window. I'd designed that room to face east specifically because Carol said she wanted morning light for her plants. She died before the azaleas she planted along the south wall grew tall enough to see over the porch railing. That was 16 years ago. The azaleas were taller than the railing now. I trimmed them every April. I got out of the car. The suitcase wasn't heavy. I registered that the moment I picked up the handle, a single, reflexive lift to test the weight. The same motion I've used on 1,000 job site tool cases over 40 years. It wasn't heavy, which meant they hadn't packed much, which meant they expected me to come back for the rest. I carried it up the 3 porch steps. Nathan opened the screen door before I reached it. He was wearing the gray Henley I'd seen him in last Sunday, at the same table where we'd eaten dinner every Sunday for 22 years. The round oak table I'd bought at a furniture store on Powell when he was 8 years old because Carol said round tables were better for conversation. No one sat at the head. He looked at me, and then at the suitcase, and then back at me. "Dad," he said. I didn't answer. I looked past him at the hallway. The photograph from his Portland State graduation was still on the wall where I'd hung it. I'd driven to the hardware store on a Tuesday morning to buy the right anchor bolt for that section of plaster, the old horsehair kind that doesn't hold a standard nail. I remembered kneeling on the hallway floor with a level, making sure it was straight. While Nathan stood behind me and said it didn't need to be exact, I told him it did. That was 3 years ago, 8 months before the suitcase. There had been a dinner a Friday in February, the kind Nathan and Diane hosted occasionally for people I did not know well. A couple named Reeves, friends from Diane's design certification program, and a man named Garrett who worked with Nathan on contract projects. 6 people at the round oak table Carol had chosen for conversation. I had arrived at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and the particular care of a man who understood he was a guest in his own house. I made a comment about the addition the sunroom because Garrett had asked about the house's history, and it was a natural thing to mention. I said I had poured the foundation myself in 1998, that the east-facing glass had been calculated for morning light. Nathan laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind that functions as a correction. He said, "Dad drew some sketches. We had a contractor do the actual work." Garrett nodded and moved on. Diane smiled at her wine glass. I looked at Nathan. He was already talking to Garrett about something else. I had designed that addition on graph paper over 3 weekends. I had pulled the permit myself. I had been on site every Saturday for 11 weeks. There had been no contractor. Nathan had been 16 and had helped me lay the tile. I said nothing. I finished my wine. I drove home at 9 o'clock and sat in the car in my own driveway for a while before going inside. 3 months before the suitcase, Diane's sister had a birthday party for her daughter, a 5-year-old named Maisie, who I had met twice at holidays. It was a Saturday afternoon in July. I had not been invited, but I had not known that until I arrived. I had bought a small wooden puzzle at a shop on Hawthorne, the kind with painted pieces that fit together to make a farm. I had driven 20 minutes. Diane answered the door. Behind her, I could see the living room balloons, a folding table with a cake, 6 or 7 children running between the adults. Her sister, Renata, was visible in the kitchen doorway. Nathan was somewhere further back, holding a drink. Diane stepped slightly forward, not quite blocking the entrance, but close enough. She said, "Walter, we thought this was just going to be the kids' friends and their parents. It's a little chaotic in here." She said it pleasantly. She was very good at pleasant. I was holding a wrapped puzzle. Renata had seen me from the kitchen doorway. She looked at Diane. She looked at me. She did not say anything, but she turned away in the particular way people turn away when they have witnessed something they do not want to have witnessed. I said, "Of course. Tell Maisie happy birthday." I set the puzzle on the porch railing. I drove home. I called Arthur that evening. It was the second call in 3 months. I told him I thought we were getting close to needing the amendment ready. He said he had been thinking the same thing. He said he would have Patricia's contact information pulled up by Monday. From the yard next door, I heard the sound of a garden hose. Owen Marsh had lived at 4217 since 2010. He retired from the Postal Service 3 years ago, 31 years of the same Eastmoreland route, which is how he knew every house on the block better than most of the people who lived in them. He was standing at his fence with a green hose, watering the row of hostas along the property line. He had stopped watering. He was looking at the porch. I looked at him. He looked at me. He looked at the suitcase in my hand. He looked at Nathan in the doorway. Owen didn't say anything. He was not the kind of man who said things when silence was more accurate. I nodded once. He nodded back, turned off the hose, and walked toward his back door without looking over again. He was giving me privacy. That was the thing about Owen. He understood the difference between witnessing something and intruding on it. I turned back to Nathan. "All right," I said, "let's talk." Diane spoke first. She had clearly thought about this longer than Nathan had, and her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation until it no longer felt like a conversation. She talked about space. We need space, she said, to grow as our own family unit. She talked about healthy dynamics and the importance of boundaries, and she used those words the way someone uses words they've recently learned, carefully, as if they might break. I recognized the framework. Carol had a colleague once who spoke the same way, a woman who had read every book about family systems and could describe the architecture of dysfunction with clinical precision while standing inside one. I let Diane finish. I had watched Diane for 7 years, not with suspicion, with the same attention I brought to any structure I was responsible for. And what I had come to understand was this: Diane was not performing certainty. She had achieved it. She had built, over the years, an internal architecture in which the arrangement she was describing Walter finding something more suitable, the house becoming theirs, the accounts simplified under one name, was not greed, but logic. She had told herself the story so many times that the story had become load-bearing. I had seen this before, in clients who had convinced themselves a structure was sound because they needed it to be. The belief was real. That did not make it accurate. There had been a moment, 2 years earlier, when I thought I saw the seam. I had come by on a Wednesday, unannounced. I had left a level in the garage, and Diane had been at the kitchen table with a spreadsheet open on her laptop and a yellow legal pad beside it. She had closed the laptop before I reached the kitchen doorway. Not quickly, just closed it. The way you close something you are not hiding, but are not ready to explain. She had looked at me and said, "Walter, I didn't hear you come in. I had said I was just getting the level. She had nodded and offered me coffee. I had said no and left. I had thought about that closed laptop for a long time afterward, not because I knew what was on it, because of the half second before she closed it, the moment when she had seen me and made a choice. A person with nothing to reconsider does not make that choice. She had made it, and then she had offered me coffee, and by the time I reached my car, she had already, I suspected, finished making her peace with it. Nathan stood slightly behind her and to the left. He was looking at the floor near the baseboard, then at the window, then at his own hands. When he was 9 years old, he told me he hadn't broken the garage window when he had. He'd looked at the wall behind my left ear for the entire conversation. 30 years later, the geography had shifted. Now it was the baseboard, the window, the hands, but the principle was the same. Nathan had never been able to look at me when he was saying something he didn't fully believe. Diane said this was good for everyone. She said it would give Walter, she called me Walter, which she had started doing sometime in the last 2 years, the opportunity to find something more suitable. She didn't say more suitable for what. She said the Lakeview Inn had a quiet room available, that she had already made a call, that it was only 38 miles north and very comfortable. She said it the way you'd describe a reasonable option to someone who had no particular attachment to where they slept. I watched her while she talked. She was not a cruel person. That was the thing I kept coming back to, standing on that porch with my suitcase at my feet. Diane was not cruel, she was certain, which is sometimes more dangerous. She had built a picture of how things should be arranged, and I was a piece that no longer fit the frame. She wasn't wrong that the arrangement was uncomfortable. She wasn't wrong that Nathan needed to stand on his own. She was only wrong about whose house she was rearranging. When she finished, the porch was quiet except for a car passing on the street below. I said, "Diane, do you know whose name is on the property insurance policy for this house?" She stopped. Not the way people stop when they're thinking, the way they stop when something has shifted beneath them and they're not sure yet what moved. She looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at her. Neither of them looked at me. I picked up the suitcase. I walked to my car, set the suitcase in the trunk, and opened the passenger side door. The manila folder was on the seat where I had left it Friday morning. I had placed it there before driving to the hardware store, before coming back to find Nathan's text waiting on my phone, before any of this had a name. I checked the time. 4:47. I had 13 minutes. The office on Morrison Street was a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. I had called Friday at 7:15 in the morning, before Nathan's text arrived, before I knew exactly how the day would end. I had asked for a 5 o'clock appointment on Sunday. The woman on the phone said they closed at 5. I told her I only needed 20 minutes. She said she would leave a note for Patricia. Patricia Sung was at her desk when I came in. She had processed Carol's estate documents in 2005, the trust formation, the deed transfers, the beneficiary designations. She had been a notary for 31 years. She looked at the folder I set on her desk, then at me, then back at the folder. She put on her glasses and read the top page without speaking. She turned to the second page. She read that one too. She picked up her stamp. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask why I was there on a Sunday evening with a suitcase in my car. She pressed the seal and signed her name in the margin, and the sound of it, that small, deliberate click, was the only sound in the room. I signed once, one line. The pen moved, and then it was done. Patricia slid the document into the envelope I had brought. I sealed it myself. She watched me do it and said nothing. I thanked her. She nodded once, the way people nod when they understand something they have no need to say aloud. Outside, the rain had started, not hard, just the kind that arrives quietly and stays. I put the envelope in my jacket pocket and got in the car. I drove north on Lombard, 38 miles to the cabin near Sauvie Island, a road I had driven so many times I no longer needed to think about it. The wipers moved. The engine held its note. The envelope sat in my pocket, and the question of what was inside it would keep until Monday morning, when Arthur Voss opened his office at 8. I drove. The rain kept coming. Room 214 was on the second floor, facing the water. I set the suitcase on the luggage rack and sat down on the edge of the bed without opening it. The lamp on the nightstand gave off a yellow light. the kind that makes everything look older than it is. Outside the window, the lake was flat. The rain had stopped sometime between Lombard and here, and the surface of the water held the last of the evening light without moving. I sat there for a while. Carol said it to me on a Thursday in October 2005, 3 weeks before she died. We were in the back bedroom, the one with the window that looked out at the Douglas fir I had planted the year Nathan was born. She was sitting up in bed. She had a good day that day, meaning she was able to sit up. I was in the chair beside her, and we were talking about Nathan, the way we always talked about Nathan in those last months, because she knew she was leaving and she needed to say everything she had not yet said. She looked at me and said, "Walter, you love Nathan in a way that keeps him from growing up. That's not love. That's fear." I told her she was tired. She said she wasn't. She said it again. The same words, slower. I told her I understood. I did not understand. I drove home from the hospital that night and made myself dinner and did not think about what she had said, because I had learned over 41 years of marriage that Carol was often right about things I was not ready to hear, and the only way I knew how to handle that was to wait. I waited 19 years. Tonight, sitting on the edge of a hotel bed with a lamp that made everything look old, I thought I was beginning to understand what she meant. Nathan was 11 the summer we drove out to Selby Island with 2 fishing rods and a cooler. It was a Saturday. He sat on the bank beside me and held his rod the way I had shown him, and after about 40 minutes, he pulled in a small bass, maybe 8 inches. Nothing remarkable. He looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me. "Dad," he said, "what do I do now?" I showed him how to hold the fish, how to work the hook out without tearing anything. He watched my hands the entire time. When I finished, he held the fish over the water and looked at it. "If I let it go," he said, "is that okay?" I told him it was. He opened his hands. The fish held still for a second, the way they do, as if it wasn't sure the world was real yet. Then it moved, once, and was gone. We both watched the place where it had been. I picked up my phone from the nightstand. The screen showed 3 messages from Nathan, all after 7 o'clock. "Dad, you okay?" Then, 11 minutes later, "Just checking in." Then at 8:47, "Call me when you get a chance." I read them twice. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and looked back at the window. The lake was still flat. The last of the light was nearly gone. I would call him. Not tonight, but I would call him. There were things that needed to happen first, papers that needed to be reviewed, a conversation with Arthur that I had been waiting 19 years to be ready for, but I would call. I turned off the lamp. In the dark, the water outside the window was just a shape lighter than the trees, darker than the sky. I lay back on top of the covers without undressing and looked at the ceiling. Carol had been right. She was usually right. I just needed longer than most people to catch up. Arthur Voss's office on the 9th floor of the Pioneer Courthouse Square building had not changed in the 28 years I had been coming to it. The same dark walnut desk, the same 2 chairs across from it, upholstered in a fabric that had once been burgundy and was now closer to the color of old brick. The same framed survey map of Multnomah County on the wall behind him, not a decoration, Arthur had told me once, but a reminder that property is always more complicated than it looks on paper. I had been a civil engineer for 31 years. I had agreed with him then. I agreed with him more now. He was already pouring coffee when I came in. He didn't ask how I took it. He had known for 28 years. 2 sugars, no cream. The cup filled to 3/4 because I never finished a full cup anyway. He set it on the edge of the desk nearest my chair and sat down without saying anything about the hotel or the weekend or the fact that I had called him from a parking lot on Friday afternoon with the particular flatness in my voice that he had learned, over the years, to take seriously. We had spoken for 11 minutes on Friday. I had told him enough. He opened the folder on his desk. It was thicker than I remembered, though I had not looked at it in several years. The tab was labeled in his assistant's handwriting, Crane Family Preservation Trust, East, March 2005. The paper inside was the kind that yellows slowly, and some of it had begun to... "Do you want me to go through the language?" Arthur said. "Or do you remember it?" "I remember most of it. I said. Go through the parts that matter for what we're doing. He nodded and put on his reading glasses. He was 71 years old and had the deliberate manner of a man who had stopped being in a hurry sometime in his late 50s and never went back. I had always found that quality useful in a lawyer. Carol established this in March of 2005. He said, "You were both present for the signing. The trust holds all real property, the East Moreland house, the lot on Sauvie Island, and at that time, the Beaverton property, which was sold in 2011. The structure designates you as sole trustee for the duration of your lifetime. Nathan is named as primary beneficiary." He paused. "Conditional beneficiary." "Conditional," I said. "Conditional. He receives full ownership rights to the trust assets either upon your death or upon your voluntary written transfer of trustee authority. Neither has occurred." Arthur set the page down and looked at me over the rim of his glasses. "Walter, Nathan has never owned that house. He has never had his name on a deed, a title, or any instrument of transfer. He has a right of residency as a beneficiary, which is meaningfully different from ownership." I drank some of the coffee. It was good coffee. Arthur had always kept good coffee. "Diane asked me about a healthy dynamic," I said. Arthur looked at me for a moment. Then he looked back at the folder. "I see," he said. "She said they needed space. She said it would be better for everyone. And the house they were asking you to leave is not theirs," I said. "Has never been," he said. He closed the folder and set it to the side with the particular precision of a man who has handled enough estate documents to know that the way you treat paper tells people what you think of what's inside it. The utilities are in your name. The property tax is in your name. The homeowner's insurance, which, as I recall, you've reviewed annually for 32 years because you don't trust auto renewal on a property that size, is in your name. Nathan and Diane have contributed nothing to the maintenance, the taxes, or the insurance in the 7 years they have lived there." He paused. "That's not a legal judgment. That's what the documents show." I thought about the addition I had built in 1998, the sunroom off the kitchen, poured foundation, double-pane glass. A project I had designed myself on graph paper at the kitchen table over 3 weekends. Nathan had been 16 then. He had helped me lay the tile on a Saturday in October, and we had worked without talking much, which was how we worked best together in those years. I had not thought about that Saturday in a long time. "He never asked," I said, "about the ownership. He never asked who held the title. Did you expect him to?" I set the cup down. "I expected him to be curious about it eventually. A man lives in a house for 7 years. He should wonder at some point whose name is on the deed." I looked at the survey map on the wall. Diane controlled those conversations. Every time money came up, she redirected. I noticed it. I didn't push. Arthur was quiet for a moment. That was one of the things I had always valued about him. He did not fill silence with reassurance. "You said on Friday that you had something to give me," he said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and set the envelope on the desk. It was a standard legal envelope, the kind Patricia Sung kept in the drawer behind her counter, and it was sealed with the notary stamp still visible through the paper where the wax had pressed against it from outside. Arthur picked it up, examined the stamp without comment, and opened it. He read the amendment once, then he read it again. The second reading took longer than the first, which told me he was not confused. He was being careful. Arthur was always careful with documents that mattered. He set it down and looked at me over his glasses. "Walter," he said, "you signed this yesterday." "Saturday afternoon," I said. "Patricia Sung's office on Morrison. She was there until 4. He was quiet for 3 or 4 seconds. Outside the window, the city was doing what Portland does on a Monday morning in October, gray sky. Steady movement. The particular unhurried pace of a place that has decided long ago it does not need to prove anything. "All right," Arthur said. He did not say, "Well done." He did not say that was smart. He said, "All right." And he set the amendment beside the trust folder and squared the edges of both documents so they were aligned. "Then we need to talk about next steps." He walked me through it without rushing. The amendment modified the conditions of Nathan's beneficial interest, not his right of residency, which remained intact as long as the trust was active, but his path to ownership. Under the original trust, Carol had written in a provision she called the Readiness Clause language that Arthur had drafted at her specific request, and that I had signed without fully understanding at the time why she wanted it. I understood now. The clause required that before any voluntary transfer of trustee authority, the beneficiary demonstrate financial self-sufficiency by means of independent verification. Carol had not defined the terms precisely in 2005 because she had expected we would revisit the trust before Nathan reached his mid-30s. We had not revisited it. Life had moved in other directions, and Nathan had not asked. The amendment I had signed with Patricia did three things. It defined the readiness clause in specific, measurable terms, completion of an independent financial counseling program approved by the trustee, and documentation of self-sustaining income for 24 consecutive months. It did not remove Nathan from the trust. It did not disinherit him. It did not punish him for Friday evening, for the suitcase on the front porch, for Diane's careful language about healthy dynamics. It simply said, when you are ready, when you can show that you have built something that is yours, not mine, the house will follow. This is what Carol wanted, Arthur said. He was not asking. She told me the night before she signed the original, I said. She said she was afraid we were making it too easy. She said a house given too soon becomes a ceiling instead of a foundation. I paused. I thought she was being hard on him. I told her so. And now I think she could see further than I could. I picked up the coffee cup. It was nearly empty. She usually could. Arthur looked at the amendment for another moment, then closed the folder over both documents and set his hand flat on top of it. It was a small gesture, not dramatic, just definitive. The kind of gesture a man makes when he has decided that the work is clear and the next step is simply to begin. I'll have my paralegal prepare the formal filing, he said. County Recorder's Office, standard timeline, 3 to 5 business days. He looked up. Do you want Nathan notified through our office or through you? Through me, I said, when I'm ready. He nodded. He did not ask when that would be. He had known me long enough to know that I would not say I was ready before I was. I stood up and put on my jacket. The coffee cup was empty. I left it where it was. Arthur, I said, did Carol ever tell you what she hoped for him, not the legal language, what she actually hoped? He considered the question. She said she wanted him to know what it felt like to earn something. He said. Not because she didn't love him, because she did. I picked up my coat from the chair back and walked to the door. Behind me, I heard Arthur open the folder again, already working, already moving to the next step. That was the thing about a good lawyer. He did not wait for you to leave the room before he started. The elevator was empty on the way down. I watched the floor numbers change and thought about a Saturday in October, 26 years ago, and a boy who had helped me lay tile without talking much, and how I had thought at the time that the silence meant everything was fine. I had been a civil engineer for 31 years. I knew how to read the stress points in a structure. I had just never applied that knowledge to the right building. Sandra's office was on the 4th floor of a building in the Pearl District, 2 blocks from the river. I had been coming to this office for 16 years, first with Carol, then alone after she was gone. The receptionist, a young man named Joel, who had been there for maybe 8 months, told me Sandra was expecting me. He said it before I gave my name. Sandra Yee was 54 years old and had the particular stillness of someone who had spent 3 decades reading numbers that other people preferred not to look at directly. When I came through the door, she was already standing beside her desk. The folder was already on the table. It was thick-tabbed, color-coded along the right edge, the way she organized everything she considered significant. She had not waited for me to ask for it. She said, I made coffee. It's fresh. She poured a cup and set it in front of the chair across from her desk. Then she sat down and opened the folder to the first tab without preamble. I sat down. The coffee was hot. I held the cup without drinking. I pulled everything from January 2017 forward, she said. That's when the regular transfers started. She turned the folder so I could read the top sheet. Monthly average $17,840.50. She let that number sit for a moment. Over 84 months. She turned to the second tab. Total disbursed $1,498,602. I looked at the number. It was printed in a clean font at the top of the summary page. The way Sandra printed everything, no drama, no emphasis, just the fact. That's the gross figure, she said. I've broken it into categories on the next page. She turned again. The breakdown was organized into 7 line items. I read them in order. Property maintenance, $200 per month. That was the label I had approved when Nathan told me the Eastmoreland house needed upkeep beyond what he could manage. What it actually covered, Sandra explained without inflection, was the mortgage equivalent cost of their occupancy utilities routed through the household account, landscaping contracted in my name, 2 roof repairs I had authorized by phone without seeing the invoices. The house has no mortgage, she said, but the maintenance line functioned as one. Vehicle lease, $890 per month. Diane's car. I had signed the authorization when Nathan said her previous car was unreliable for her commute. I had not asked where she commuted to because at the time I thought I knew. Education and professional development, $11,400 total, distributed across 14 months. Sandra turned to a subtab. The itemized list showed an interior design certification program at a private school in the Northwest District, enrollment fee, materials, studio rental for a final project. The program was 18 months. Diane had withdrawn at month 9. The remaining tuition had been non-refundable. I had received no notification of the withdrawal. The authorization I had signed covered the full program. Travel $2,100 per month, averaged across the 7 years, though Sandra noted the actual charges were irregular, heavier in summer, lighter in the 2 years during the pandemic. The account description read, family travel and hospitality. I looked at that phrase for a moment. Family travel. I had been to one dinner at their house in 7 years that had not ended with me leaving early at Nathan's suggestion. I had not been on a single trip that this line item had funded. Household subscriptions and recurring services, $340 per month. Sandra had put a small paper clip on this page. She waited while I read it. The itemized list was 2 columns wide streaming services, a wine club, a meal kit delivery that had run for 22 months, a fitness app, a digital magazine bundle, all of it billed to the household account, all of it authorized under a blanket approval I had signed in 2017 when Nathan said it would simplify the household budget to run everything through one account. $340 per month. That was what I had been paying so that Nathan and Diane could watch films on Sunday evenings. The Sunday evenings when I drove home to a dark house on the east side. I set the coffee cup down. Sandra was watching me, not the folder. I said, "How much of this did Nathan initiate directly?" She opened the 3rd tab. Requests that came through Nathan the vehicle lease, the initial travel authorization, the subscription account. Everything else came through Diane either directly or through a shared email address they both used for household matters. She paused. In my assessment, Nathan was aware of the large categories. I don't believe he knew the specific figures. She tapped the summary page. He didn't know where half of it came from. The maintenance line was structured in a way that would have looked like property management to anyone who didn't know the underlying accounts. I had designed that account structure myself 15 years ago, when the Eastmoreland house was still a place where Carol and I had Sunday dinners, and the boys Nathan and his college friends would come and go and leave dishes in the sink. I had built it for simplicity. It had been simple, in the end, just not in the way I intended. Sandra closed the folder to the cover page and looked at me directly. She said, "Walter, I wanted to have this conversation with you last year. I flagged several of these line items in the annual review, but you didn't ask." She said it without accusation, the same tone she used for everything, flat and precise. I prepared a summary then. I still have it. She opened the left drawer of her desk and set a second folder beside the first. Thinner. Dated 14 months ago in her handwriting on the tab. I said, "I know." She held my gaze for 1 second. Then she turned back to the open folder, "What do you need from me going forward?" I told her I needed a consolidated report clean, dated, with the source documentation attached for each line item, not for litigation, for transparency. When the time came, I wanted Nathan to be able to read the number himself and understand what it represented, not as an accusation, as a fact. Sandra nodded once and reached for her keyboard. "I can have it ready by Thursday." "Thursday is fine." She began typing. I picked up the coffee cup again. It was still warm. Outside the window, the river was flat and gray under the November overcast, and a crane, the construction kind, not my name, was moving slowly along the waterfront 2 blocks south. I watched it complete one full rotation and thought about a calculation I used to teach junior engineers the difference between load-bearing capacity and actual load applied. A structure could carry far more than it was ever asked to carry. The failure point was rarely where the weight was heaviest. It was always where the support had been quietly, incrementally, removed. Sandra printed the first page. The machine ran without stopping for a long time. Pacific First Bank was on Burnside, between a dry cleaner and a sandwich shop that had been there since before Nathan was born. I had driven past it so many times over 30 years that I no longer saw it as a destination. It was just part of the route. The way the Morrison Bridge was part of the route. The way the Eastmoreland neighborhood itself had become something I moved through rather than arrived at. But I parked in the small lot on the side street and sat for a moment before going in. The lobby smelled the same as it always had, something between fresh paper and recycled air, with a faint trace of the carpet cleaner they used on Mondays. I knew it was Monday. I had been keeping track of days the way I used to keep track of project milestones, not because I needed to, but because structure was the thing that kept a job from becoming chaos. 4 years into retirement, I still did it. Some habits are not habits. They are architecture. Gregory Halm was at his desk near the back when I walked in. He saw me before I reached the teller counter. He had the particular peripheral awareness of someone who had managed a public-facing space for a long time, always tracking a movement at the edge of his vision. He stood up before I got halfway across the lobby. We shook hands the way 2 men shake hands when they have been shaking hands for over 30 years. No performance in it, just the familiar weight of the other person's grip. "Walter," he said, "no appointment." "No appointment," I said. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I sat. He sat. He did not reach for a form or a notepad. He just looked at me with the settled patience of a man who had learned over 11 years at this branch, and however many years before it, that the people who came in without appointments were usually the ones with the most important business. I had worked with Gregory on the mortgage for the Eastmoreland house in 1991. That was 33 years ago. He had been a loan officer then, young enough that I remembered thinking he looked too young to be handling numbers that large. He had processed the paperwork without errors and explained every clause without being asked. I had trusted him then for the same reason I trusted him. Now he did not confuse thoroughness with delay. I took Sandra's printed pages from the folder I had carried in and set them on the desk between us. 6 recurring transfers. I said, "I need to stop all of them." Gregory picked up the pages. He read them the way engineers read specifications, not scanning, not skimming, but moving through each line with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that a single misread figure changes everything downstream. He turned the first page. He read the second. When he reached the third, he paused. I did not look at what line had stopped him. I did not need to. I had prepared the list myself, with Sandra, and I knew every name and amount on it by memory. The third page began with the largest transfer, $4,200 per month, to the joint account held by Nathan and Diane Crane at this same branch. Gregory set the pages down. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Give me a few minutes to pull these up." He turned to his computer. I looked at the lobby while he worked. There was a young woman at the teller window depositing something in an envelope. There was a man in a construction jacket waiting behind her, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The carpet near the entrance had a faint wear pattern from the door, 30 years of people coming and going, pressing the same path into the same fibers. I had noticed it before. It was slightly more pronounced than the last time I had been here. Gregory typed without speaking. I heard the small sounds of the keyboard and, beneath it, The ambient noise of the branch, the distant printer, the air system, the muffled conversation from the teller stations. After a few minutes, he stopped typing and looked at the screen with an expression I had seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but the careful, neutral face of a person absorbing information they had already half expected. He knew Nathan's name. I understood that in the silence before he said anything else. Gregory had been at this branch long enough that names on recurring transfers were not abstractions. They were people who sometimes walked through the same door I had just walked through. I did not know the specifics. I did not ask. But something in the way he had paused on the third page told me that Nathan Crane was not an unfamiliar name in this building. What I found out later, not from Gregory, who said nothing, was that Nathan had come into this branch 14 months ago to request a credit limit increase on the card he held here. The request had been denied. Insufficient independent income. The notation said. Nathan had not told me. I had not known to ask. The card he used for the things he did not want Diane to see, the things I had found listed in Sandra's spreadsheet that morning, had a limit of $8,000. He had been carrying a balance of $7,640 for most of the past year. The minimum payment came out of the joint account. The joint account was funded, in part, by the $200 I sent every month. I did not know any of this in the chair across from Gregory's desk. I only knew what Sandra had shown me. But sitting there, watching Gregory work through the list with that careful, neutral expression, I understood the shape of it. I'd been a structural engineer for 31 years. I knew how to read a load diagram even when I could only see part of it. Gregory stopped all recurring transfers. He went through them one by one, the $200 to the joint account, the $800 to Nathan's individual account, the $940 for the insurance premium on the car registered in Nathan's name, the $620 for the storage unit on Southeast Powell, the $380 for a subscription service I had never heard of but had been paying for since 2021, and the $290 for a gym membership that Sandra's records showed had never once generated a check-in log. 6 transfers, a combined total of $230 per month. Over 7 years. That number became something I had already calculated that morning, sitting across from Sandra while her printer ran. When the last one was processed, Gregory set his pen down on the desk, not dropped set, with the deliberate placement of someone who understood that small gestures carried weight in quiet rooms. He looked at me. "Is there anything else I can do for you, Walter?" he said. "No," I said. "That's everything." He nodded once. We stood at the same time. He extended his hand, and I shook it the same grip as before. No different, as if nothing unusual had just happened in this office, as if we had simply concluded a routine piece of business between two men who had known each other for a long time, which, in one sense, was exactly what we had done. I walked back through the lobby. The young woman at the teller window was gone. The man in the construction jacket was at the counter now, filling out a deposit slip. The wear pattern near the entrance was exactly where it had been when I came in. I pushed through the glass door and stepped onto Burnside. The November air was cold and carrying a faint smell of rain that had not arrived yet. The traffic on the street moved in the ordinary afternoon rhythm of a Tuesday, not heavy, not light, just the persistent forward motion of a city going about its business, regardless of what had just happened inside a bank branch on the corner. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the cold settle around me. I took my phone out of my jacket pocket. Nathan had called 4 times. The first call was at 1:43 p.m., the second at 1:51, the third at 2:02, the fourth at 2:14. I had been inside the bank for 31 minutes. The calls had started 8 minutes after I walked in, which meant something had triggered them, the transfer system, possibly, or a notification on Diane's phone, or simply the particular anxiety of a person who had been waiting all morning for something to happen and had finally felt it begin. Diane had called twice, at 1:55 and 2:09. There were no voicemail. There were no text messages. I looked at the call log for a moment. 4 calls from Nathan, 2 from Diane, 6 in 31 minutes. The last one had come in 3 minutes ago, while Gregory was setting his pen down on the desk. I put the phone back in my pocket. The traffic light at the corner changed. A line of cars moved through the intersection and then stopped again. Across the street, a woman was walking a dog that kept stopping to investigate something at the base of a utility pole. She waited each time without pulling the leash, just stood there, patient, letting the dog finish. After the third stop, the dog looked up at her, and they continued together. I stood on the sidewalk for a little longer, not because I needed to think. The thinking was done. Sandra's printer had finished that part of the work. What I needed, though, I would not have named it that way. Standing on Burnside in the November cold was simply the moment between one thing ending and another thing beginning. Engineers know this interval. It is the time between when the load is removed and when the structure settles into its new configuration. You cannot rush it. The material needs to find its own equilibrium. I walked to my car. It was parked on the side street, third space from the corner, between a pickup truck and a bicycle that someone had locked to a parking meter with an excess of cable. I unlocked the door and got in. The seat was cold through my jacket. I put both hands on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the brick wall of the building across the alley. Carol had said something in 2005, the spring before her diagnosis. Sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Eastmoreland with the trust documents spread between us and Arthur Voss's business card, sitting on top of the stack. She had looked at me over the papers and said, in the particular quiet voice she used when she was saying something she had thought about for a long time, "The hardest thing you'll ever do for him is stop catching him before he falls." I had not understood what she meant then. I had thought she was talking about something theoretical, a future version of Nathan who would need to learn a lesson I had not yet imagined. I had signed the documents and thought that is a problem for later. Nathan had been 11 years old in 1996, the summer we took the boat out to Sauvie Island on a Saturday in July. He had caught a bass, not a large one, but real, solid, alive in his hands, and he had held it for a moment, looking at it, and then, without any prompting for me, he had leaned over the side of the boat and let it go. He had watched it disappear into the dark water. Then he had looked up at me and said, "It should go back." I had said yes. He had picked up his rod again. I thought about that fish. I had not thought about it in years. Then I started the engine. I drove west on Highway 30 past the industrial yards and the grain elevators that lined the river, past the places I had driven past 100 times on the way to job sites in the 90s. The sun was low behind the clouds. It had not fully broken through all day. I passed the Sauvie Island Bridge and crossed onto the island without deciding to. Or that is how it felt. My hands knew the road. I had been coming here since before Nathan was born. The parking area near the North Shore was empty. A single crow sat on the wooden post at the trailhead. I pulled in, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands in my lap. The dashboard clock said 4:17. I had been in the notary's office 4 hours ago. It felt like a different week. I got out of the car. The air was cold and smelled like mud and dead leaves and the particular stillness that settles over water in October. The heron was there, or a heron. I could not be certain it was the same one I had seen every fall for the past 6 years, but it stood in the shallows 20 yards out with the patience of something that had long ago stopped expecting anything to be different. I watched it for a while. It did not move. The water was gray-silver and flat, and the far shore was a dark line of cottonwoods losing their leaves. I had not eaten since morning. I did not feel hungry. I stood at the edge of the water until the crow left the post and the heron finally stepped, slowly, deeper into the shallows, and the light went flat and gray, and the cold came up properly from the ground. Then I got back in the car and drove to find a room. The room I found was not at the Lakeview Inn. It was a small motel on Cornelius Pass Road, the kind of place with a parking lot you could see from the highway and a vending machine outside the ice room. The woman at the desk did not ask questions. I paid cash for 2 nights and carried my bag to room 7 myself. I slept without dreaming, which was unusual. I woke at 5:40 and lay still for a while, looking at the water stain on the ceiling. It was shaped like nothing in particular. I got up, made the thin motel coffee, and sat in the single chair by the window. The parking lot was empty. A light rain had started. On Wednesday, my phone showed 11 missed calls from Nathan. Diane sent an email at 9:14 in the morning. I read it twice. It was carefully written, the kind of careful that takes drafts. She used the word misunderstanding once and the phrase would love to reconnect twice. She did not say she was sorry. She said she hoped I was well and that she and Nathan both cared about me very much and that she thought there might have been some confusion about timing and intention. She wrote that she knew transitions could be hard for everyone. I set the phone on the table and looked at the rain on the window. Diane was not a stupid woman. That was the part I had understood from the beginning, and it was the part that had made everything harder to watch. She had written that email the way an engineer draws a load-bearing wall, knowing exactly where the weight needed to go. She had not apologized because an apology would have been an admission, and an admission would have been a concession, and Diane did not make concessions. I had recognized that quality in her the first year. I had told myself it was strength. I had been half right. I did not reply. On Friday, Nathan drove to the Lakeview Inn. I know this because Bev, a woman who had worked the front desk there for 9 years and who had checked me in and out enough times to know my name without looking at the register, told me later. She said a younger man had come in. Dark hair. Said he was looking for his father. She had told him I had checked out Tuesday morning. He had asked where I'd gone. She had said she didn't know, which was true. He had stood in the lobby for a moment. She said, just stood there. Then he had walked out. She said he had not left a message. I thought about that for a long time afterward. He had not left a message. He had driven 40 minutes, stood in a lobby, and driven back. No note, no name at the desk. He had come to find me. And then, when I was not there, he had gone away empty-handed and left nothing behind. I did not know what that meant. I was not certain Nathan knew either. 2 weeks after the morning on the porch, Arthur mailed a formal letter to the Eastmoreland address. He had prepared it the previous Friday, the same day I had signed the amendment, and he had held it at my instruction until the following week. It arrived on a Tuesday. The letter outlined the structure of the Crane Family Preservation Trust, as Carol and I had established it in 2005, and it described the amendment I had executed and notarized. And it stated clearly that the conditions under which Nathan remained a beneficiary had changed. It also stated that the property at Eastmoreland, the house where Nathan and Diane had been living, where they had been paying reduced rent drawn against the trust's maintenance allocation, was trust property, and that the trustee had the authority to reassess occupancy arrangements at any time. Arthur had included a 60-day notice, 60 days to make arrangements. I was not in Portland when the letter arrived. I had moved by then. Frank Delgado had a cabin on the island, a small one he had built himself in 1987 with lumber he had milled by hand and a foundation I had helped him pour one weekend in October of that year. I had been there many times over the decades. When I called Frank and asked if it was available, he said yes without asking why. We had known each other since a bridge project in 1991. He said the wood stove worked, and the water heater was slow but functional, and there was firewood already stacked on the south side. I thanked him and told him I would leave it the way I found it. The cabin had one window that faced the water. I had set my drawing board, a portable one I had kept since my last year in the field, on the table beneath it, not to work on anything specific, but because I had always thought better with something flat and horizontal in front of me. An old habit. I made coffee in the mornings on the wood stove and drank it standing at the window. The heron came most mornings. I did not know if it was the same one. Diane called on the Wednesday after the letter arrived. I let it go to voicemail. She did not leave a message. She called again on Thursday. Same result. On Friday, Nathan called. He did not leave a message either. That was 3 weeks now of calls and no messages. And I had begun to understand something about the messages that were not left. They told me more than the ones that were. A message left is a door opened. It says, I want to talk. Here is what I have to say. Here is where I am standing. A call with no message is something else. It is a hand raised and then lowered. It is the beginning of something a person could not yet finish. I had been the same way with Carol in the early years. I had driven past the hospital 3 times the night her father was dying before I finally went in. I had known what I needed to do. I had just needed the time to become the person who could do it. What Nathan and Diane lost was specific. I knew because Arthur kept me informed, and because Sandra had the numbers, and because I had spent 38 years reading structural assessments, and I knew that the way a thing fails is almost always the way it was built. They had been living on $17,840 a month, the figure Sandra had laid out for me 2 weeks earlier, line by line, across 16 months of records. Of that, approximately $11,200 came from the trust's monthly distribution, and the remaining amount came from various subsidiary transfers I had been making without formal accounting. The rent they paid on the Eastmoreland house was $800 a month against a market rate of $3,400. The difference had been absorbed by the trust's maintenance account, which I controlled. When the distribution stopped and the 60-day notice arrived, they had, according to what Arthur later described to me, approximately 6 weeks of savings. Diane's income from her consulting work was real but inconsistent. Nathan had not held a full-time position in 4 years. He had done project work, contract work, occasional work, the kind of work that looks like employment in a LinkedIn profile and feels like employment in conversation but does not pay the same bills month after month without something underneath it. Diane called her mother. Her mother lived in Bend and had her own fixed income and her own concerns. She was sympathetic. She could not help materially. Nathan called an old friend from graduate school, a man named Peter, who had a spare room in Northeast Portland. Peter said yes, temporarily. Nathan moved some things there. Diane stayed in Eastmoreland for the first 10 days of the 60, and then she moved to her mother's in Bend, and for 3 weeks they were in different cities while they worked out what came next. Peter told Nathan later, and Nathan told me in the letter, one paragraph I read 3 times, that the afternoon Nathan arrived with the first load of boxes. They had stopped at the QFC on Fremont to pick up groceries. Nathan had put the items on the belt. He had reached for the card he used for household expenses, the one that drew from the joint account. He had run it. The machine had shown a number and then a word. Declined. He had tried again. Same result. Peter had been standing beside him at the register. The cashier, a young woman who had not looked up, had said, "Do you have another card?" Nathan had stood there for a moment. Peter had put his own card down without saying anything. In the parking lot, Nathan had sat in the passenger seat of Peter's car and not spoken for several minutes. Peter had not asked him to. He had started the engine and driven. Nathan wrote that he had looked out the window at the QFC sign and understood, in that parking lot, that the number on the decline screen was not a mistake. It was a measurement. It was the first accurate measurement he had taken of himself in 4 years, and it was not what he had assumed. Diane's moment came differently. Her mother, a woman named Ruth, who lived in a small house in Bend on a fixed retirement income, had been expecting a short visit. Diane had arrived with 2 suitcases and the particular careful composure of someone holding something together by effort. Ruth had made dinner. On the second evening, Diane had opened her laptop at the kitchen table to check the household account, the one that had received $4,200 every month for 7 years, and Ruth had been in the kitchen doorway when Diane saw the balance. Ruth said later, when she told Nathan, that she had heard a sound she could not describe. Not crying. Something quieter than that. Diane had sat at the table for a long time without moving. Ruth had gone back into the kitchen and made tea and brought it without being asked, because there are things a mother understands without being told. I did not know all of this in real time. Some of it I learned from Arthur. Some of it Nathan told me later, in the letter. What I did know, because Sandra tracked it and Arthur confirmed it, was what happened to the specific things. The car, the silver Audi on the lease I had been paying $890 a month for 3 years, was returned to the dealership on the 41st day of the 60-day notice. Diane drove it back herself. Arthur's paralegal had sent a formal letter to the leasing company, copied to Nathan and Diane, clarifying that the trust's authorization for the monthly payment had been withdrawn and that the lessee would need to assume the obligation independently. Diane did not assume it. The car went back. She drove to Bend in a 2009 Civic that her mother had kept in the garage since Ruth stopped driving at night. Nathan started a full-time position on the 33rd day. I know the number because Arthur mentioned it in passing, the way he mentioned things he thought I should know but did not want to make a point of. A project management role at a mid-sized construction firm in the Lloyd district, the kind of work Nathan had been doing in pieces for 4 years, now consolidated into one place, one salary, one set of hours. He had applied the week after the letter arrived. He had interviewed twice. He had gotten the offer on a Thursday and started the following Monday. Arthur said the firm was reputable. He said Nathan had listed his father as a reference and had not told me. I sat with that for a while. He had listed me as a reference and had not asked. I did not know if that was confidence or apology or simply the act of a person reaching for the nearest solid thing. I decided it did not matter which. He had reached. That was the part that counted. The Eastmoreland house sat empty for 11 days between when Diane left for Bend and when Arthur arranged for a property management company to assess it for rental. The neighbor on the south side, a woman named Teresa, who had lived there since 2014 and who had always been pleasant at the fence, called the property management number and asked about the timeline. She told the property manager she had noticed the lights had been off for a week and a half. She said she had been watering the azaleas along the south wall because no one else was. She did not want them to die. Arthur passed that along to me in an email. I read it twice and then looked out the cabin window at the water for a while. The azaleas had been Carol's. I had trimmed them every April for 16 years. Teresa had been watering them for 11 days without being asked. I wrote Arthur back and told him to let the property management company know that the azaleas along the south wall were to be maintained as a condition of any rental agreement. He replied, "Understood. Already noted." The storage unit on Southeast Powell, the one I had been paying $620 a month for since 2019 without knowing its contents, was cleared out by Nathan on a Saturday in November. He rented a truck. Peter helped him. Arthur's office had sent notice that the trust's payment authorization for the unit had been withdrawn effective the end of the month. Nathan paid the final month himself. He moved what was worth keeping to Peter's garage and left the rest for the unit's donation pickup. Arthur's paralegal confirmed the unit was vacated on time. I thought about what was in that storage unit. I had never asked. I had simply paid for it, month after month, the way I had paid for everything, not because I did not wonder, but because I had learned, over 7 years, that asking certain questions produced answers I was not yet ready to act on. I was ready now. The unit was empty. It did not matter anymore what had been in it. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, Nathan called once more. It was a Tuesday morning. I was at the cabin, standing at the wood stove with a cup of coffee in my hand, watching the steam rise. The phone was on the table. I heard it ring. I looked at the screen. His name, the photograph I had taken of him in 2019 at the coast, squinting into the sun, one hand raised against the light. I watched it ring. I counted 4 rings before it stopped. He did not leave a message. I set the coffee down and stood there for a moment. Then I put on my coat and walked down to the water. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of October morning that has no ambiguity about what season it is. The cottonwoods had dropped most of their leaves. The water was very still. I stood there until I was cold enough to go back inside, and then I went back inside and picked up the coffee and finished it. 6 weeks after the morning on the porch, a letter arrived at the cabin. Not an email, not a voicemail. A letter in a plain envelope, addressed in Nathan's handwriting, the same handwriting I had watched him practice at the kitchen table in the Eastmoreland house when he was 9 years old, pressing too hard with the pencil. The letters large and effortful and sincere. The handwriting had not changed as much as I might have expected. I got the mail at the box at the end of the gravel drive. The envelope was there between a utility notice and a catalog. I stood at the box and opened it. 4 pages, handwritten on yellow legal paper, the kind I kept in the study. I read it standing there. Then I walked back to the cabin, sat down on the front step, and read it again. Nathan wrote about the morning on the porch. He wrote that he had not known about the trust, about the house, about the full structure of what I had been providing and what it had cost me. Not in money, but in something he did not have a word for, and so left as a space on the page. He wrote that Diane had told him the arrangement was temporary and that he had believed her because it was easier to believe her. He wrote that he understood. Now, that easy was not the same as true. He wrote about the summer of 1996. He wrote that he had thought about it many times since the letter from Arthur arrived, and that he had not understood, until recently, why it kept coming back to him. He wrote about the fish, the base he had caught and held and let go, the way it had moved in his hands before it went still, the way the water had closed over it. He wrote, "I think you let me go. I just didn't know what that meant until now." He wrote that he did not know what he was asking for. He was not asking for the money back. He was not asking for the house. He wrote that he thought, maybe, he was asking whether there was anything left that was not about money or houses or arrangements, and whether, if there was, it was something he could still reach. He signed it Nathan, not Dad's Nathan, not Love Nathan, just Nathan. I folded the letter along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of my coat, against my chest. I sat on the step for a while longer. A woodpecker was working somewhere in the cottonwoods to the south, the sound of it irregular and patient. The morning light was coming in low across the water, catching the surface in a way that made it look like hammered tin. I had seen this light here before. I had seen it the morning Carol and I had brought Nathan here for the first time, when he was 4 years old and had stood at the edge of the water in his small boots and had been very still, the way children are still when something is larger than they have words for. I had thought, that morning, that I would have more time. I got up and went inside. I put the kettle on the wood stove. I got the coffee from the shelf, the same brand I had been buying since 1991, the year I started working with Frank, the year the bridge project ran over schedule and we had spent 6 weeks drinking bad coffee out of paper cups in a trailer on the South Bank. I measured it out. I waited for the water. When the coffee was ready, I poured it and stood at the window. The heron was there, at the edge of the shallows, standing in the particular way it stood when it was not hunting, but simply present. The fog had not burned off yet. The far shore was still soft and indistinct. I had not decided what I would say to Nathan. I had not decided if I would call or drive or write back. I had not decided how much of what had been broken could be rebuilt, or whether rebuilt was even the right word for what I was hoping for. I was 66 years old, and I had spent 40 years building things that were meant to hold weight bridges, foundations, retaining walls, structures designed to last beyond the people who built them, and I understood that the things worth building took time and required patience and could not be rushed without consequences that showed up later in the places you hadn't checked. I had not rushed anything. I had simply stopped holding things up that needed to learn to hold themselves. The coffee was hot. I drank it slowly. Outside, the heron lifted from the shallows without any apparent reason and moved across the water in that long, slow wing beat that always looked like it was barely enough to keep something that large in the air. It disappeared behind the cottonwoods. The fog was still on the water. The cabin was warm. I had a letter in my coat pocket from my son, and I was not ready to answer it yet, and that was all right. Some things needed to be held a while before you knew what to do with them. That was enough for today. If you've ever held something important in your coat pocket and known, without quite knowing why, that today wasn't the day to open it, you already understand everything this story was really about. It isn't weakness. It's the particular patience of someone who has spent a lifetime building things meant to last. If these stories find something true in you, I'll be here.